we'll go in through the side. This is a classic European oyster here called a bologna. This is the main bologna, they're grown in Maine. So they would go in through the side here, closest to the adductor muscle, hit the muscle, cut it, and pull back. And that's how they present. Generally in Paris, they don't shuck the bottom. They don't sever it. They want to keep it attached. That's proof of freshness. Because back in the day when tinning happened, they would put oysters in tins on the coast. Then they would put them on a plate. They have oyster plates for collectibles now. And the customers would eat them. They go, it tastes a little too tinny, right? This is over. It doesn't taste good at all. So they wanted to have the proof of freshness. So the smart restaurateur would take old shells, take the tin oyster, put it in the shell. Here you go, it's in the shell. They go, no. You're going to be attached to the bottom shell. So to this day, they leave it attached to the bottom shell. What we can do, I can shuck the oyster that it feels like it's still attached, but it's not. You hit the muscle just underneath, it still attaches to the back towards the hinge. I can actually hold an oyster up, it'll stay there until you touch it, it'll slide right out. So that's a perfectly shucked oyster, which is very hard for even me to explain to pro shuckers, because a lot of them will shuck it, then flip it, but you get docked points in the World Championships. So back to where I come from, which is Toronto. I am four-time Canadian world champion oyster shucker and Guinness Book of World Records, which, Guinness Book is all nice, that gets you the most media stuff, right? Gets you around the world. But the one that's most I'm happiest about is more the World Championships, Galway Bay, Ireland, because it is a judged sport, very loose term, like curling is a sport, more of a drinking sport than anything else. So you are judged on how well you've opened up an oyster. So you want to be free of any grit, no cuts, not flipped in the shell. So you will end up, if you flip the oyster in the shell, you can tell because it always goes to the right, and if you flip it, it goes to the left. So we want to keep it perfectly shucked, and therefore usually you flip it because you've torn the top mantle, torn it off, either wholly or half, or cuts, and then you flip it. So it looks good in the end, but you're also giving only half an oyster. The European style of shucking oysters, where they actually shuck in the back to this and pull it off, a lot of times they'll pull that top mantle off as well. The oyster is set up with two mantles. That's the top one. There's 4 sets of gills on the inside, and then there's a bottom one. The mantle is what holds the cilia. Cilia is a bit of hair, that hair-like structure that captures phytoplankton and zooplankton. That's what they filter out of the water, and they bring it to their stomach, which is down here, and they digest that very slowly. Highly packed in algae. So it's very, very, very good for you in that sense. The gills extract the oxygen just like a fish gills does. And so that's why it's very good for the environment as well, being super sustainable. The more oysters you put in, the better it is for the environment. They're not like charcoal filters or furnace filters where they'll filter everything out of the water. They're very persnickety, phytoplankton and zooplankton. That's what they store. And so when we have oysters, we have a great variety of them here today, which is fantastic. This is rare to find, the Boulogne oysters. Has anyone tried Boulogne oysters before?
Yeah.
You probably have. Okay, that's cool. So we're going to show you a couple for tasting as well. The way that I taste out the oysters, I usually talk about oysters the way sommeliers will talk about wine. Where they come from, the heritage, the species. So it starts with the top 5 species, of which we have here, Kumamoto. There's a cushy. Okay, so you have 4 of the 5 species here. We'll do 2 of the East Coast species so we can show you the difference of the same species of oysters based on regions. The flavor comes from species, region, then method of growth, how it is grown, whether it's at the top of the water or the bottom of the water, rack grown, bottom finished. There's different ways of doing things. And usually when I'm discussing, say, a flight of oysters, you will go from mildest to the boldest flavors. I always try to describe flavors of oysters in positive words as well. You don't want to say this is too big, it's too strong. It's bold flavors, ocean flavors, that type of thing. Same thing as if you're trying to sell off some wines and whatnot. So usually you start with an East Coast oyster. North America's East Coast oysters are Chrysoster virginicus. They grow from New Brunswick all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. The whole region of that side. It's the only place in the world where that oyster grows, but you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of different varietals. And sometimes different oysters, the same oyster will look differently, even though it's the same species. You'll get different flavors. I usually find that oysters are bigger in flavor, more ocean flavors, the further away from the equator you go, whether it's northern or southern hemisphere. So you'll find saltier flavors up in the northern parts, let's say New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, as it goes down through Maine and New York, New Jersey. Around the Chesapeake Bay area, there's an influx of a lot of fresh water, so it starts to flatten out a little bit as it goes south. Now there's going to be pockets here where it's got a little higher salinity, and they'll usually taste compared to, just like those Prince Edward Island oysters from Canada, has got this nice salt content. So I haven't tasted any of these yet, so because I just got here, and we were just shucking, just got out of the car. So, but we're going to try the two East Coast oysters and see what you think about the flavor-wise between the two of them. So usually I start with East Coast oyster, then I go to a West Coast oyster, Crassostria gigas oyster, which is this one right here. Now this is a cushy oyster coming out of British Columbia. It's tide tumbled oyster, so it's grown at the top of the water in a little flat rack that allows the tide to, as the tide comes and goes, it shakes this rack on the line, and as it rolls around, the oysters will be tumbled. And you can see it's got a very teardrop, smooth shape on the outside. Normally a West Coast oyster tends to be very rugged, a lot of fluted shells, sometimes a lot bigger. Beach oysters you'll find are a little bit bigger. But they grow these specifically to a cocktail grade size so that most people will enjoy it and enjoy it as a one bite taste. So the flavor differences, East Coast oysters start off with salt and sweet, a little variety of those type of flavor ranges. West Coast start getting into the complexity, ocean sea salt, sweet cream, melon, and cucumber. On all of the species, no matter where it comes from, whether it is from Europe, whether it's from Asia, whether it's from North America, if it's the same species, Crassostria gigas, that's the flavor range base. Salt, sweet cream, melon, cucumber. And it comes and goes. Same thing with the East Coast oysters. Sometimes salty up front or salty in behind with a sweetness. And it can be vegetal sweet or it can be just plain sweet. Then you get into the Kumamoto oyster. This is a Kumo here. It is a a Humboldt Bay, California Kumo. There's a purebred Kumamoto as well, grown from Taylor shellfish up in Washington State. They originally came from Japan in the 1920s. Seed stock started growing here from a little oyster grower and then expanded from that. So there's only a couple of places that will actually grow a Kumamoto. This is a Crassostria sakima species. It tends to have a bit more pronounced buttery, sweet cream flavor to it and very minimal salt. Depends on the region that it comes from. But always designed, grown into a small cup shape like this naturally. These oysters are grown to a point that emulate the Kumamoto because the popularity of the Kumamoto was such through the 80s and 90s, the 1980s and 90s, for those of us who might not have been there at that time.
No.
See?
I was there in the 90s, but I'm the 80s.
Yeah, some of us have been. So there was the Kumamoto became something very popular, and a lot of the growers thought it was the size that it was, but it's also the flavor and the texture. So growing them to this size was very popular. Then the East Coast people saw that, hey, they're serving these oysters are so small. Our oysters, this would have been a small choice oyster back in the late 90s, and now we've got what's called cocktail grades, which emulate this size.
So those will fit in the Kumamoto shell, right?
Sorry?
Those will fit in the Kumamoto shell,
yeah,
right?
more or less. See, that's the whole idea. But they try to get it out into a cocktail grade so they can get it out faster. So when you're growing something, you don't want to spend all your time growing it. You want to get it out so you can get your cash flow. Customers tend to like that. They like the cocktail grade. It gets up there at a softer price point. So restaurants like it because we can get oysters in, show them, possibly do bucket shuck, which still doesn't sustain anything really in the sense, but it gets the information out there to the oyster people. So those are three oysters that we start with. That's the Crassostria family. Then you have the Ostera family. And of that, there's two of them. One is missing. It's the little Olympia oyster. Indigenous, it's the only oyster that's indigenous to North America on the West Coast. All of the oysters that are on the West Coast, all your Pacifics, all your Kumamoto, everything that you know actually came from Asia. The only one that's indigenous to North America is the Olympia. It's part of the Ostera family. So it's got a big complexity to it. Like the Boulogne oyster, this Boulogne oyster here actually came from either originally through the 40s, it came over into Cape Cod and up through Maine as an experiment. But it takes about 3 to 4 years longer to grow than the native oyster. So it was like, that's too long, abandon this ship, forget it, we're not going to grow this anymore. Well, what happened, lo and behold, that they took root and actually grow here wildly. There's no work done on them at all. They do still run with that old adage, do not eat oysters in months without an arm. That's based on a European oyster. This was written in the 1500s by an English monk. So in England, that species, in those months, starting in May, does a reproduction cycle, which holds its young, the female of the species holds its young in the gills. All oysters will switch hit. After each year, they'll change sex. Because, you know, has anyone done it 30 million times? I like 29. If you've done it 30 million times, you don't want to switch it. Because that's how many times each oyster can reproduce itself that much every year. So male, female, male, female, it'll flip back and forth. These flavor range in the Ostera family has that metallic range. Sometimes people, it's a love-hate relationship. When you get oysters, I would say oyster eaters are about 10% from the general populace that go out to enjoy food. 10% will enjoy oysters. Of that, 10% will like the European oysters. So it's a minute fraction of the number of people who actually go and enjoy them. But when you get something like this, it's highly coveted. If you can handle it, make it look good, have the flavor range and showcase it, it's something that people will go and drive halfway across town because, oh, the Maine ballons are in. They start off in May to September, you can't get them. Because when they hold on to their young in their gills, they're not very palatable, one, and two, if you pull them out, then you don't get new oysters next year. The first person to actually uphold that written thing in the 1500s was Napoleon. Because when he crowned himself emperor, he likes oysters, everybody likes oysters all of a sudden. He just drained the whole ocean, more or less. And one year, servants came up and said, sorry dude, you don't got no oysters this year because you ate them all. So because that's what we're going to do. From May to September, no oysters, then we'll do oyster season after that. And that's where September becomes, in Northern Hemisphere, our oyster season starts in September. That's where you get all the festivals. Festival season goes insane. I get pulled all over the place. I have to go to Europe, New York, in Canada, both coasts, through September till November, more or less. I don't have to live in Toronto. It's bonkers. So, but I get the pleasure of going out and seeing nice folks like yourself and talking about oysters. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to taste the differences. Now, when I'm suggesting to taste oysters in a restaurant in my place, I think of sauce like lingerie, less is more. You'll get more out of the oyster the less you put onto it. So you'll get the true taste and the flavor of the oyster. And what you're going to find most interesting, same species, Prince Edward Island, Virginia, if you try it, what you do is you slide it in, chew it up, 2 bites, breathe in through your mouth. Like a sommelier would tell you, swirl the wine, swirl it in your palate so that when you breathe in, oxygen helps your palate understand what you're experiencing flavor-wise. So that's why we're going to try that one, and we're going to try it both ways. Just chew it up, breathe in, and you'll see the difference in the flavors. This should be a little bit more salty with a sort of a sugary sweetness to it. And this will be a little bit more meaty with a very sort of a freshwater cleanliness to the finish of it. Not very bold at all. Great texture on it, very good for cooking oysters. When I shuck oysters right-handed, I pick up the oyster, put it on the block, and hinge towards me. The hinge of the oyster, all oysters are pretty well done the same, except this one, which is, well, they're still the same. It's really round as opposed to a teardrop shape. So teardrop shape, even this has a little point to it, shows you where I'm going to open up through the hinge. So teardrop shape points to where you want to open it. You want to put cup side down so you can hold all the liquor. And the liquor is the clear liquid of the oysters, not the bottle behind me. So I put it down, and I'll use this fancy glove. It's not just mesmerizing, the ladies just love it. It doesn't just match MeUndies. It's actually practical in the sense that you hold on to the oyster. It's like a cloth, but you can hold on to it really, really well. Generally, you can get cut by the shell more often than you will by the knife. This is actually sharper than this. All right, so if you're holding on to an oyster right here and it slips, you get all this down here. So this really does more for holding the oyster than anything else. So you go in like this, into the hinge. Now I'm giving it a little wiggle, whoops, and a forward push. And these, this oyster coming from Virginia?
Are they? Are those the Virginia?
Yeah.
These are skipjacks from Virginia. There's a reason why Virginians shuck lip side, and I'll show you that in a second. And this is basically the reason. So that's how I'll usually do it. This one doesn't have the sponge to it. Now here, this is the difference between sponge and not sponge. There you go. So again, going through the hinge.
Those are Massachusetts, Paddy.
These are from Mass?
Yeah.
Okay, they do have a bit of sponge on them, so turn, cut, and then cut the bottom. So I'll put that there. Again, in through the hinge, give it a little wiggle. These ones kind of open up very easily. Across the top. If they're having trouble with the hinge, this will deter a lot of restaurants from buying them. So I tell the growers, there's 2 things I tell growers. One, you find out, the first thing you do is you find a nice space to grow your oysters. Second thing is you work on your shell. This is what's happening here. These little potted holes, that's called boring sponge. It's a sponge that actually grows into the shell of the oyster and causes osteoporosis, gets it very brittle. So you want to get an oyster that does not have that, but you can see that a lot of these do.
Bag raspberry points down there now too.
Super, okay. But generally speaking, so this is why down in Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, where there's a predominance of this, they will bill shuck or lip shuck oysters, which means they go in through the hinge here. They go in through, and sometimes they'll either do, that's why difference of knives kind of work. Mine really works best with through the hinge. But you in through here, and then you cut the bottom, and then pull the top off. So you'll have this come up like this. But because that hinge was going to crumble away, now they'll profess this is a lovely, and it is, it's a lovely, good looking, big fat oyster, but it's not in the top, bottom shell. You'll lose a lot of the liquor, then you'll just cut off, but you can still eat that fabulous looking oyster right there. That's why there's different styles of shucking oysters based on the different regions, and this really happens from about where I say around the New York area south, and sometimes you'll find it a little bit to the north as well. But this, when you see it, you have to read your oyster and kind of learn how you're going to do it. So again, I just go in through the hinge, little forward pressure, little quarter turn, opens up that oyster. As I come across the top, cut that with this side of the blade, and then cut the bottom with this side of the blade here. So I turn that oyster, I'll look for any grit, and then I'll put it out, present it. And I can make an oyster look very nice, very pretty well all the time. Just depends on the whole thing. So you got to do a lot of the read and the whole works. When it comes down to competition, what it is, you shuck as many world championships as 30 oysters. Canadian championships is 18, American is 24. You shuck the set number of oysters and you present it as fast as possible and as clean as possible. So I will pick up with my knife hand, put it down, shuck it, present it, and grab the next two. So I'll end up going up like this all the time. These ones tend to be some of the harder oysters to open. You can see here by the size of the adductor muscle. This is the adductor muscle right here. The oysters are called bivalves. Really it's right and left rather than top and bottom. But bottom looks good for us because it'll hold all the liquor. So it's really technically right and left. But the adductor is with the thing that holds the two shells together. And there's a little elastic in the back and the hinge that wants the shell to be open all the time. So the oyster doesn't expend energy staying open in the ocean living. So no energy spent. Only time it spends energy is when it closes up its shells. The muscles are contracted. The Z degree coming through here, eh? Kinesiology finally kicking in 27 years later. Mom's like, ugh. And so closes up really tight. And then these oysters versus these oysters will have a higher percentage of slow twitch muscle than fast twitch. Fast twitch muscle means you're a sprinter. Slow twitch muscle means you're a marathon runner. So these oysters won't hold on very long. They can close up really quick as long as they need to. But if you put an elastic band on it, it will help the oyster not expend energy by putting pressure on, and the muscle doesn't have to work as much. So growers have found over the years that elastic band generally works because you're only going to get about a week to a week and a half before they start opening. Normal East Coast oysters that come from colder water or whatnot, you can get up to 4 weeks. It travels around the world beautifully, like New York oysters up through Maine and into Canada, about 4 weeks out of water. Because tide goes out, they have to learn how to survive themselves. West Coast oysters, Kumamoto's, usually about 1 to 2 weeks, and then these ones will get sort of the least of what you do.
Patty, when do they put the band on?
You harvest up
When
oyster.
they harvest them.
When you harvest up the oyster, it's a lobster. It's the thing, you know, the lobster bander. It's a little thing. You go like this, it expands, and you just jam it on. So usually they get that when they're processed. They'll tong it all up. By the time you start processing, putting them in a box, they'll put bands on them. These ones, a little bit more technique is required for this oyster. This is the species of oyster that we work at for the World Championships. It's in Galway Bay, Ireland every year. So this oyster looks exactly the same, and it's the same one that confounds a lot of people when they finally get there. But what you got to do, our oysters tend to have deep cup, and when you're shucking this oyster, I actually want to bring my blade to match the depth of the cup when it's coming in the hinge, and also want to come out and emulate the outer, I'm right-handed, so outer rim is what I call it. So I want to come in on this angle. I don't want to come in straight flat because you're going to be in the middle of the meat. You want to come in on the outside angle so that when you see this, you come in on this angle here, when I turn up, pop it, my blade rides between the meat and the outer rim to this point here where I got to shave the top off and just butter across. So the knife does not cut the meat if you got it in the right angle. Same thing with this oyster here. It's got that space between this and this is very wide. So I'm gonna come in on this angle, pop it, come across, and then cut across. But because it's very flat, you kind of lower your angle coming in. That's where it becomes very difficult in that sense. And a rolling tailor is just the best. Don't worry about it. I've had works. I've heard Ricky, the whole works. But this is where you just come into it. You just do 3 fingers. With the angle on the handle, as opposed to a straight blade, you can actually use 3 fingers worth of pressure, which is very low pressure. You don't need a lot of pressure when you're opening up oysters. You need the technique. So it's not force, it's finesse. Then you come across the top. You see where the meat is attached. You sort of butter that down. You're coming in. I'm coming in to right back there. Cut across towards myself. And voila. Oysters already popped and ready to go. Now, you got to try these ones too. You guys like these ones? Have you tried them before?
Which ones do you want to do next?
You want to go into your Pacific, and then I'm going to have that one. And it's very meaty. Fantastic meaty oyster. As you breathe in, you've got the salty up front, crisp meatiness to it. And you've got this dry tannic. If you think of it like dry red wine, rather than anything else.
I'll get the bucket over here though if you need it.
Rather than thinking, because a lot of times people think metal is a bad flavor. It does come off metallic. If you suggested them as a dry tannic red wine with a light seaweed finish, wet stone, it's a different word range that was more positive. And it is one of those things that you'll develop. This is where mignonettes come into play. This is based off the Boulogne oyster out of the River Boulogne in France. And then they would start off with a little bit of a light champagne mignonette, chopped shallots, a little pepper. But this is, all I get now is wet stone and seaweed.
Not my fave either.
Does anybody want this one, other than me?
You want it? Jack's like something.
Here you go, Jack. That's a beauty.
With the balance, I found if you cook them, that metallic flavor, that
Well,
dry
because
red wine flavor.
how you cook it?
One thing I did with them, the thing that I liked the most was I made some Thai green curry paste.
Sure.
Put a little bit of that and a little coconut milk in there, and then
That's an
threw it in
expensive
an
protein
800
source though.
degree-
What was the price per on that?
That was something I did not sell. That was something I did on Friend's house, and we.
Do it for funsies. You can't get a better texture oyster. That texture will firm up and just become that lovely piece of
I
steak.
found that they were really great that way.
Yeah, and so yes, the flavor will dissipate. Again, back to where I think of sauce with oyster, less is more. The less you put on it, the more you're going to get out of it. So if you put something on that, lemon, vinegar, the vinegar helps cut that metallic, so the vinegar and the vinaigrette comes out. And then if you wanted to add hot sauce or cocktail sauce, that covers that as well. So it's just layering out and taking away from what the aficionados would go, leave it alone. Yeah, it can be overpowering for a long while. It depends on what you think of the oyster. So yeah, you can when you cook with it, yes, everything goes from there. Smoking these things are fantastic. Like in the shell, smoke that in the shell, fantastic. Lots you can do with it. So, did you guys want to have hands on? Do you want to play around with stuff?
Go for it.
You're not
You good?
dressed right now.
Right, he's the one who's dressed.
You fold it up 1, 2, 3, that's 4. You make a little envelope, right? You'll put this little kid in here, like this, and that allows you to do as much pressure as you need. And then into the hinge here, and you'll do a little forward pressure till it sets. You know when it sets, a quarter turn. You're just turning it down. At that point in time, you can pry it open, take a look down, cut across the top, like such, and then look for any of that grit. Cut the adductor muscle right there. Now this is an example of how well, that's perfectly shucked. So if I hit it, but it stayed there. That's the style that you want to hit this. That's the only spot, that black spot right here is the only spot you want to do it. So you leave it attached, that's that proof of freshness to your Parisian friends. I had Parisian customers come to restaurants, so they go, your oysters are very good, but they're loose in the shell. Oh, okay, hold on one second. Paris, right? Yeah. So I come back, they go, ding, and they go, oh, I didn't hit the bottom at all. Put them up, they go, yeah, they're fighting with it. This is what they want to do in Paris. They go, that's a fresh oyster. I go, yeah, we're lazy over here in Canada, so we have to shuck the bottom for everybody, or else we're like, I couldn't possibly eat these. But yeah, if you can hit that and leave it like this, then you've got that thing for them. I'll eat that. Are you right or left-handed? Ooh, that's a good oyster, that Raspberry Point, eh?
Yeah, the raspberry.
The salty,
Yeah,
sweetie. Yeah, leg forward pressure. Now you're pulling down a little bit, so you want to just push it in, wiggle it in like a key in a lock till it digs itself to a point where it doesn't want to go. Then it's turning the key in the lock. It's not prying a paint can. That's it, right there. And at that point, you know that the adductor muscle is down here. You can slide it in flat and cut. That's all I do, is I slide in flat across the top and then cut towards myself. That's it. Delish. Look at that. You look for grit. Nice. Right there. Do you see that black spot? Delish.
Tilt it, let's see. Nice.
Awesome. Well done.
That's it. That's it. So what do you have? I have mappy things too. I do PowerPoint presentations.
Raspberry Point, he's talking about.
Raspberry Point. And so specifically they grow out of New London Bay, Prince Edward Sound. So if you've got the island, there's a big wonk of water up in the North Shore that's called Malpeque Bay. One over.
Okay.
One over this way. It's the smaller one called New London Bay. And it's got this nice balance of salt and sweet. There's something about that water, like Maine. There's something weird about the water in Maine that makes magical oysters.
Right.
The flavor of that is crazy. You get the bright salts and the sugary sweets. And it's something to do with this ocean and then the spring water wells. In New London Bay, there's a couple of spring water wells that bubble up under the tidal zone that sweetens that water. It gives it that flavor and that texture. A lot of nutrients in that area as well, so a lot of algae growth. And in the season, in the summertime, the oyster will actually be more of a green color. So it'll come off with greens, and now they also grow an oyster called a lucky lime, which is technically lime green. When in the summer, there's a lot of sunshine, you get that green color. Green is good when it comes to oysters. So much so that the French will grow something called a fin de clair. Fin de clair vert means its fin is finished in clair pools. Clair pools at the high tide zone, it's allowed to stagnate or become algae filled. Then you take your best oysters, throw them into the clair pools, and then the gills go green. So the gill that I showed you on that oyster would actually be that aquamarine green, this green right here, will come off with a green color. So when you shuck it, you pull back the top mantle, allow it to be shown, and there's only a couple of guys in North Carolina, there's a couple of guys that will actually be growing this. Of course, I got pictures galore. Ask me if I got any pictures of my kids. It's kind of sad they're used to it. They're way used to it now.
Last year we tried those from North Carolina that were green.
Yep.
And in addition to being green, they, what was the term that they used? I didn't think it was a good term, but they had a term for the texture. It was, I think they said it was fluffy. I would call it more spongy than fluffy.
Yeah, it was
You know,
spongy.
like when you bit into the oyster, it didn't have the crunch that some of, like the Raspberry Points have a bit of a crunch to it.
Meaty
right?
crunchiness to it.
Yeah. So
Time
what
of year will
causes the-
fatten that up though as well. See the green in the gill? Like
Yeah.
literally
Right.
wow green.
Yeah.
So I was shucking oysters in, there's a one, I forget, I forget the age, there's 2 or 3 growers that will do this. Kid comes up to him, shucking oysters at a knife shop, just doing a demo of my knife, as you do, demo things. So I'm shucking oysters in this store in New York City. Kid comes up to me and he goes, I'm an oyster grower from North Carolina. Oh, cool, excellent, that's great, congratulations, a little fella. You know, and it's like, he goes, here's a picture. And I look at it like this, I'm like, what? You have green-gilled oysters? Yeah. I go, does anybody know you have green-gilled oysters? You're like the only one in North America that has green-gilled oysters. You do this regularly? Well, it comes and goes. When the summer, we're figuring it out because it's a balance of fresh water to salt water that causes an algae bloom so dense that the diatoms get caught in the gills. And that's how it turns green. So in France, you call that a fin de clair vert. And then that is a certain level of oyster that people are expecting to be a green gill. And what you find is you get a bigger more ocean vegetal flavor out of it as well. So that's why not only does it look good, because the eyes eat first, that's why I like it, but it's also a great flavor on that. So when I import oysters, I import French oysters, one of the first things I try to do is find a very good fin de clair vert. So it comes off green, so you can showcase something different on the bed. You have to, European stuff, you gotta come up to Toronto for.
So, right, so New London Bay is part of it, right? So
Part of Prince Edward, yes.
Part of Prince Edward, but it's also part of what makes the Raspberry Point thing so good. Then the Raspberry Points come from one grower, or can multiple
Raspberry Point
growers
is the name of the
grow?
company. The company is actually called Raspberry Point Oyster Co.
Okay.
James Power, sorry, I have a little mappy here I was working on. I wonder if I have it. A snail that sticks to the outside. It usually doesn't move along a lot, it just sticks there, right? and then they stack up on slipper limpets, actually stack up on top of each other. You'll see them like this big.
Yeah.
You cut the bottom, you go, hey, look at this. But they're limpets, technically speaking. And a limpet, being a snail, is edible. Not a lot of people eat those ones. So usually we can get European limpets in, and they just live on rocks more or less. But these ones, for some reason in New York, if there's a lot of limpets on a box of oysters, you got a great box of oysters.
Awesome.
So when you keep buying from, you call up and,
Yeah.
George, where'd you find those ones?
Right.
There's like a ton of limpets. Yeah, the limpets are good. Just give me the limpety oysters.
We had to educate our customers about pea crabs, you know, at first
Oh.
they're like, oh my God, no, it's got something in it, and then we had to,
How about at the restaurant? What happens? Yeah, exactly. Customers freaking out.
We try not to give it out to the.
Yeah, that's the thing. You got
Keep
to
them
keep your eyes on it. Pea crab lives inside the shell, and it looks like what it sounds like. It's a tiny little pea. Have you seen them before?
No.
Okay, so it looks like a little yellow pea, and it's got sometimes a little red color to it. That's the apron where the roe is, and tiny little legs. And the legs go like this, but they're so small they can't walk around. So once they get into the oyster shell, and it's called commensal relationship. The oyster gets neither positive nor negative effect from the crab being there. The crab gets all of the effect of living there, both nutrients from the same nutrients that the oyster is getting, but also the protection.
Sure.
So the pea crab's the only winner. Oyster doesn't really care either way with the pea, except when we open them, and this happens down in the shucking plants down in Louisiana, from Louisiana up to Chesapeake Bay, gallon shuckers. As you're shucking for gallons, you have pea crab, so you take a little container, pea crab, oyster, pea crab, pea crab, pea crab. It's pints of pea crabs. You take them home, little flour, popcorn crabs when you get them home. It can actually, it's always fun to do though, eh? You get them in the tray, get them on the bar, you go, pea crab, check that out. Oh, it's fantastic, and people will freak out. It's either check please, or they go, I'll have two of whatever he's having. And it's great, but it tastes like soft shell crab. It's because what it is a really soft shell crab. And it's very, very soft, and it's what it tastes like. So you can put them out there, and in a sushi bar it would be fantastic, because people will understand that this is what we do. And you'd have this, imagine having like a dozen on like a thing of rice with a little, and just like going like this. And hey, a little lemon, and they're like, oh, that's, groovy. But pea crab is a thing. And so when you get the pea crabs in, you gotta watch for that. Other things that live on the outside, you've got tiny little shrimp, little sea urchins, mussels, sometimes fish, but sometimes there's also a mudworm that will live in certain types of beach growing oysters, and they'll end up living inside the shell. And you got to keep an eye out as a shucker. You know that you're going to have a mudworm. There's probably a worm there. As it pops open, the little thing goes, hey, what's going on?
we've never had one. Thank
No,
God.
well, there's different regions that will have them more predominantly than not. Again, Chesapeake Bay and mudflats, so West Coast mudflats. The West Coast oyster that's got that fluted shell and all the barnacles, they'll be in and around the outside. So you give it a good wash and everything will be fine. But if it pops out, like shuck it, if it pops out it lives in the shell. It does not live in the oyster. It doesn't harm the oyster at all. All these things that most people think are parasites are actually creatures living on the outside. And so, good Toronto people, they're all like landlocked, sort of like Albany. Getting there, almost. It'll take me 3 years, I think, before I get right to it. Landlocked, right?
He thinks it's right down the middle.
Yeah. So, and the little worm will actually get up and it goes into the saltwater. Saltwater creature does not like fresh water. Put oysters on ice, ice melts, ice is fresh water. Worm goes, fuck, this is terrible, sorry, this is terrible, I don't want to be here. It pops out, it does its little thing, and it ends up being in the shell. Again, it's just to say, I'm sorry about that, that is actually a mudworm, and 17 minutes later go, if you stop talking, I will be fine. Exactly. So yeah, I'll leave if I can stop talking. And the other one is little shrimps. And they look like little like fleas almost, right? And they flick around and they'll jump this far. So again, when they hit the freshwater, they're freaking out and going, oh my God, and they're swimming all over the place. So you hit them in a tray. The tray is a little bit of water, and they start whatever doing. That's krill. Now I go, well, technically it's whale food. So, oh, it's delicious, but you need like 10,000 before you actually fill out. I got you, oh, I'm sorry, did you want that one? And so I'll get you another one if you want. So I like to teach the people along the way. It always irons it out. Otherwise, you can always do. They see one little krill,
Yeah.
Whole plate goes back.
We got a batch once that it was infested with those worms. I mean, we put
Yeah.
it in water and they came out like
Yeah.
all over. There would be like 5 or 6 per shell
Yeah.
coming out of it, and some made it to the table with like that, and there's no explaining it. There's no
You
like,
know,
stopping
yeah.
it. Yeah, at that point, it's like sorry, you know.
Oh, yeah, no, I always, I say, yeah, sorry, I'll get you whatever you need, but just so that you learn,
Yeah.
this is a mudworm, it lives on the outside and or into the inside, does not harm the oyster whatsoever. But I know that you want to have a fresh one, not a problem. So that, you go back and shuck the oyster into a bucket. I always, whenever you shuck, because of this, I can't serve that, but I can certainly cook with it. So that oyster gets saved. I always, all the shuckers have a little container and you save all that stuff up. So when those wormy things come through, and you know, you'll always look at you can tell by opening up the box. Sometimes there's water. Oh, if you don't have box, then you don't have water. So
We have some boxes.
some boxes, we'll see. Sometimes the worms will be at the bottom of it too. So it's always a good thing to keep your eye on it as best you can, and then just try to deal with it at that point. Sometimes you just gotta.
What areas are they mostly from? Because I don't remember having anything like that in a long time, but it was.
It was
One
like
time, it was
James
like a
River.
lot.
James
Chesapeake
River, a lot of more freshwater. So when I say
Yeah.
Chesapeake Bay becomes more of a freshwater body than anything else, that's where the salinity flavor comes down. A lot of times when you see a certain, I go to the Masters and I shuck at the Masters, I see people from all over the states come in, and they talk about the oysters that I'm showcasing, some Prince Edward Island oysters, and then they'll go, wicked salt, they're too salty. What'd you do? You put too much salt in them. I'm like, that's the ocean water, man. Because if you're in brackish water, where are you from? Like Virginia. Oh, okay. I understand the oyster you're looking for here. Have one of these. Okay, that's great. Then they'll put it on a saltine cracker because they need more salt. Or they'll literally put salt on. Like I've had people go, I need salt. Put salt on oysters. I'm like, you won't need that. None of these, man. You know, the cardiologist is going to call me in the morning and say, what did you do to him? You know. So there's different things that you look for and such. But yeah, so worm essence. Really New York south towards Chesapeake Bay, and I don't experience a lot from the Gulf, but anything that's been bottom finished, because that's where it's going to go. If it's a rack grown, if you know that it's an aquaculture product that's on rack, they won't have that problem, because the wormies only go through the mud, through the soil and such. And then some West Coast beach oysters, where the cushies are all rack, they're all grown at the top of the water. You can get beach oysters, sometimes real big, but they'll be craggy and whatnot, and they'll have little buddies all hanging out and everything. All over the place. It's just a good wash is all you gotta worry about that. I talk too much? I got the hook?
No, there's just some folks who are anxious to see you, and we're a little after 5.
Busy here. Cool, excellent. Oyster stout was where I was gonna go with that. It's a thing. I've been doing an oyster stout since the late 1990s with a couple local brewers up in Toronto, and we came up with a concept of how it actually, the best and easiest way to do it. But it can be a regional thing as well. Originally, it's from the UK. So we would have used these oysters in the beer. So the flavor-wise, the oyster stouts that we make here in North America are completely different than what the original one would have been. So if I get all hooked up, eventually one of these days I'll get hooked up with a brewer and we're gonna work this out perfectly. I'll have a Kumamoto, or I'll have a West Coastie, and then I'll have a Prince Edward Island one, which is the one I usually only use. It's a PEI oyster from New London Bay, and I just put them in whole into the boil. So they boil out, cook out, meat, liquor, shell. The shell gives it a nice minerally, like almost like a Chablis finish, where the Chablis got that nice mineral finish to it. So if you add shell to your stout, it will come off with that flavor, because this is calcium. That's where Chablis comes from.
Daniel, we're doing a thing with Great Flats Brewing, and they're asking us to save our shells at the end of it. So they're going to be making a beer out of an oyster stout out of it. You did really? So go back at the end of March.
Yeah, and the March.
There you go.
Nice, we'll be there.
Nice.
Delish.
Cool.
Yeah.
I do other things. I pair oysters with whiskeys. That's one of my little things that's in my new little book. I do it online or whatnot. Did I do it in this?
Good work.
I figured this one out last time I was in Scotland, because Talisker Distillery, Isle of Skye, is 150 feet away from the Isle of Skye Oyster Farm, in the same little bay. And what it is there's this freshwater stream that bubbles out of the hills, it comes down, and that's what the spring water they use to distill, but it also sweetens the salt water. Freshwater is the term sweet water. So the sweet water comes in, makes whiskey, but also finishes off this oyster. I was like, this is the closest thing, and then I thought about it, I go, oysters and whiskey regions are around the world. You can't get grape variety, you can't get grapes in Ireland. As the tide comes and goes, it shakes this rack on the line, and as